Hi, I'm David. So for this problem, we're given two functions. One is f of x is equal to the square root of x minus 7, and the other one is g of x is equal to 4x squared. And they're asking us to find the domain of both of these functions as well as the domain for f of g of x. So let's break this into pieces and go one step at a time. First, what is domain, right? What is the definition of domain? What is domain again? Domain, it is defined by all possible values of x. In other words, domain is anything and everything that x could possibly be in order for the equation to be valid. And let's recall that whenever we have a square root symbol, the final result inside of the square root has to be equal to 0 or above 0. It has to be positive, right? We can't have the final result inside of a square root symbol being negative. We can't have the square root of a negative number, otherwise we get an imaginary number. And we don't want an imaginary number, we want real numbers, right? So what we can do is take this of x minus 7 and set it to be greater than or equal to 0, right? What we're saying is whatever this end result is, has to be greater than or equal to 0. What matters is that the whole thing cannot be negative, right? So then to solve for this, we just add 7 to both sides, and we're left with x is greater than or equal to 7. So for example, if x was 7, we can plug it in. 7 minus 7 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. That works. Cool. What if we plugged in 8, right? 8 is above 7. If we plugged in 8, we would get 8 minus 7 is 1. The square root of 1 is 1. Also good. That works too. But what if we plugged in a 6? 6 is less than 7, right? So if we plugged in a 6, we would get 6 minus 7 is negative 1. And remember, we can't have the square root of negative 1. That is an imaginary number, and we don't want an imaginary number. We want a real number. So this would be the domain for the f of x function. Now let's look at the g of x function. Here we have what we call a quadratic, right? That's when we have an x squared. So whenever we have an x squared, that ends up being a parabola, right? As we recall from algebra, we have a parabola, right? And with parabolas, the domain is all real numbers. In other words, x could be anything and everything. We can plug anything in for x for this equation to be valid. We can plug in a 0. Right? 0 squared is 0 times 4 is 0. We can plug in 100, right? That would work. We can plug in a negative number. We can plug in fractions, decimals. Everything and anything in between would make this equation valid. So the domain for this function is all real numbers. Next, what they want us to do is to find the domain for f of g of x. So what is f of g of x? So that is f of g of x, right? Or another way they write it, here's another way they can write it. Sometimes you'll see it written this way. It's the same thing. It's just a different format for the same meaning, right? What we're pretty much doing is taking g of x and plugging it in to f. We're taking whatever g of x is and plugging it in for x inside of the f of x function. So what is that? That would be the square root of 4x squared minus 7, right? So notice this is pretty much these two functions combined, where you have the f of x function, right? You have the square root and the negative 7, but instead of an x, we're plugging this part into it. We're plugging the 4x squared into the x. So here is the function of f of g of x. And now they want us to find the domain for this function. The way we find the domain for this function is the same way we found the domain for this function, right? Again, we can't have a negative result inside of the square root, right? Otherwise, that would give us an imaginary number. So we can do 4x squared minus 7 is greater than or equal to 0. It has to be positive. The end result has to be positive, cannot be negative. So to solve this, we add 7 to both sides. That gives us x squared. 4x squared is greater than or equal to 7, right? And then we want to isolate the x, so we divide both sides by 4. The 4's cancel out. On this side, we're left with x squared is greater than or equal to 7/4. So x is greater than or equal to the square root of 7 over 2, or x has to be less than or equal to negative square root of 7 over 2. And that is how we solve this problem. Thank you.